So this video is going to focus on input and output in Perl. First, we're going to cover standard input and standard output, and then we're going to follow that by learning how to read and write from files in Perl. It's really important you already understand how arrays and strings and basic Perl syntax as well, so that you can follow along. First, we're going to start with standard input. In Perl, we have access to anything entered through standard input through a pre-created file handle called standard input. So it's all capital letters STDIN. How we use and access file handles is we surround them by angle brackets like this. So for example, if I wanted to save all of the lines from standard input, I'd want to put this into an array context. So I might do that by creating an array called input and making it equal to the file handle. What that will do is take all of the lines from standard input, it splits them on the new line and saves each line into that array. So the length of the array will be the total number of lines that we've gotten from standard input. And now that I've got all the lines in an array, we can just access them like normal in Perl. So I can make a for each loop with my index, go to whatever the length of the array is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out the index for us so you can see how many elements there are and where we're up to in the array, followed by the line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to uppercase it so that we can see that there's been a change made. So I'm going to uppercase our line, which is going to be input at the index. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to run our program and I'm going to give it some input. So this is some input. And now, what I'm going to do to tell the program that it's finished, I'm going to hit Control D to say that I've reached the end of entering input. So I'm going to hit Control D. Okay, and now we can see we've got our output. So we've got at index 0, the line this, at index 1, the line is, and at index 2, the line some input, which we can see are each of the separate lines of input. Now you'll notice I didn't actually have to add a new line here to the end of my print statement. Normally we have to do that in Perl, but we don't actually have to because each of these lines here already has a new line at the end of it, so I don't need to add one. If I were to chomp each of the lines like this, then I'd need to add a new line. But because I'm not doing that and they've already got new lines on the end, I don't need to add one in my print statement. So that's nice. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to do exactly the same thing, except I'm just going to print the input just as a normal array using a for each loop. So if I just wanted to get the line for each of the lines in our array like this, so just get all the values from our array, and then I'm going to print the lines uppercase like this. So just like we would with a normal array, if we just wanted to get all the values like this. Oops. Oh, what have we got here? Got to change that to line. Okay. io.pl, this is some input. Right, again, Control D, and then we've got each of the lines in our array, so this is some input. Now, we could shortcut this by instead of saving it as an array and then using a for each loop, Perl is smart enough to know that if I'm using a for each loop and if I put a file handle in, because it's in an array context, what it'll do is it'll essentially treat it as if it's an array. It'll take in all of the lines and then it'll iterate it through as if it's an array and print them one by one. So now when I run it again, it runs exactly the same. Control D, yep, exactly the same as before, except with one less 9, so that's nice. But what if I don't want to go through all of the input all at once? What if I want to process things line by line? It's often better to actually work through standard input line by line instead of having to wait for all of standard input to come in which case we use the file handle in scalar context. For example, what I might do is if I had, let's say I wanted to get line 1, I have a scalar variable and then I'd use our file handle. That will give me the first line, then I could have line 2, That would give me the second line, etc., etc. And I could go on for all the different lines of input. But that would be a bit repetitive. So, whenever I want to do something over and over again, we would use a while loop in Perl. So instead of writing out all the individual lines, I could say while line is equal to standard input. And then I can process each of the lines one at a time. So I could do what we did before. I could print the lines uppercase. But in this case, we're using it in a scalar context, so it's just going to process each line one at a time. You'll see the difference when I run the program. So when I run our program and type this and hit enter, you can see it processes the line immediately. Is, and then some input, and then Control D to exit. So this means I can process each line as the program is running, instead of having to wait for the whole thing at the end. So, for example, what I can do now is if I wanted to make an exception for a particular line, let's say I wanted to not print out the first line, I could call standard input here. What that will do is that'll essentially save it to the default variable, and nothing will happen. And then what it'll do is it'll go through the rest of the lines of input and print them uppercase. So that way I can specify doing something special for the first line. So if I do this, run my program, this, nothing happens, is some input. Yeah, there we go. And that is how you use a file handle in a scalar context. Now, what if we wanted to decide to send it to somewhere in particular? Now, print by default actually sends all our output to standard output, which is pretty convenient for us. But what if I wanted to specify that? So what if I wanted to intentionally send something to standard output? Print actually takes in a file handle as the first argument. So I could use standard out, which is a predefined file handle for us. And this will print to standard out, which should work exactly the same as we've seen before. So I run the program, this is some input, and we can see it's printing to standard output as per normal. So Control D to finish, all right? So similarly, if we wanted to print somewhere else, let's say I wanted to print to standard error, there's a predefined standard error variable. So standard error. Now I'll run the program again. We know standard error should appear in the terminal, so this is some input. And just to show you that it's actually printing to standard error, if I redirect our standard error to somewhere else, we can see that it doesn't print anything out. And that's because we're printing to standard error. All right, and that is how you send something to a particular file handle. So that is how you read from standard input and print to standard output in Perl. As we'll see next, having the ability to choose which file stream print will send the line to will be really helpful for printing to other non-standard file streams. For example, if you're writing to a file instead of just standard output or standard error. So this covers how to read from standard input and write to standard output, also standard error. But what about files? Well, similarly to C, we have two special functions called open and close. These functions help us to create our own file handles in Perl so that we can read and write to files. So I have a file here called input.txt, which has these lines. This input comes from a file called input.txt. And so I'm going to create a file handle to open this file and read from it instead of reading from standard input. Now, open has three different arguments, which my text editor Sublime will helpfully recommend. So we've got these three arguments. The first one is the file handle, the second one is the mode, and the third one, the expression, is essentially the file path. So the first thing that you do is we're going to create a new variable, which is our file handle. So I could create a variable like this for our file handle, and this method is often preferred, in which case you'd access it like using the angle brackets like before. using our file handle like this. Personally, I like to use the all caps version, like file or file handle, because it just visually reminds me that I'm supposed to treat it like I would standard input or standard error. What we then do, once we've got our file handle, the second argument is the mode. Now there are different modes. Typically you'll be using one of three: reading, writing, and appending. Now if you are familiar with Bash, you'll have seen these before. For example, if I have a program, my program, and I want to give it input from somewhere else besides standard input, I'd use the angle bracket like this, and I'd, let's say, read from input.txt. Similarly, if I was to produce some output and want to send it to a file, I might do this. Or if I wanted to append to a file, I would use the double arrow here. And that is exactly the same syntax that Perl uses for the mode. So if I wanted to read, I'll use the inner angle bracket. And the last one, the expression, is where are we actually going to read the file from? Now I have a file in the current directory called input.txt, so I'll put that here. Now remember, when you open a file, the next thing that you should always do is close it. So we'll use close here, and we just pass it the file handle, which in this case I've just called file. Now our program here will work exactly the same as before, except now I'm going to change both of these variables to what I want. So instead of reading from standard input, I actually want to read from my file, so I'm going to put in my file handle instead. And I don't want to print to standard error, I want to print to standard output. I could put nothing here, that would work exactly the same, but I'll leave that there for now. So, if I run this program now, it'll behave exactly the same as before, except now it's going to be reading input from the file instead of from the terminal. So when I run it, it says this input comes from a file called input.txt, and it's capitalized all the lines and it's read them from our file. Now let's talk a little bit about safety. So far we've just assumed that all of our files have opened successfully, which isn't necessarily the case. Hopefully, thankfully, hopefully they all work straight away, but they might not. So in Perl we have this really helpful way of running multiple commands if the first one fails. So we can use OR in this special way where we either do this thing or we can do that, just like this. So in this case we want to either open the file or we want to essentially fail gracefully. Presumably our program won't work if we can't open the file, so we've got to somehow fail in a way that tells the user that there's a problem that's gone wrong. So what we want to do after our open is we want it to open or something else has to happen. There's this function that we can use in Perl called die, which does kind of exactly what it sounds like. It'll kill the program if something fails. So in this case, it'll either open our file successfully or it will die. So now when I run this, it should work the first time because input.txt exists. But if I change it to something else, let's say dud file.txt, when I run it again, oh, it died. And it told us that it died in this program, io.pl, at line 3. That's helpful information. But what if we want to add some more helpful information than that? Well, what we can do is we can actually pass an error message to die. So I'm going to move this on the next line. We can actually give die a string, which is our own error message. So what I might do is save the file path in a variable here so that we can use it in our error message. So we might say something like cannot open file path with a new line at the end. Now when I run this broken program, it gives us this helpful error message, cannot open dud file.txt. But we don't just have this as a helpful error message. There's also something that we can use called $bang. Oh. Now I won't tell you what this does, I'm just going to show you. No such file or directory. In fact, it told you what the problem was. So this hashbang has told you why the program died, no such file or directory, but it hasn't told you which no such file or directory. So usually you might do something like, yes, cannot open $file path, and then you put this there. That way you know what it tried to open and failed to do. So if I run this again, cannot open .file.txt, no such file or directory. There you go. And that is how you safely open files in Perl. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at file output. What if I want to output somewhere besides just standard output? Well, what we can do is we can actually open a file for writing. We'll do it similar to the syntax above. So I'll copy this. Maybe we'll do file in is our file input.txt. We might have file out equals output.txt, file in, and same here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to open a file for writing. So I'm going to change the mode to writing. We're going to write to file out. And we can also run into problems when we're trying to open a file for writing. If you're trying to open a file to write to it and it's a directory, it'll shout at you, or if you've run out of memory on your computer. So you might say something like, cannot create file out, something like that, or problem reading to writing out, reading to file out. And so we'll have an error message there too. And just like before, when we have our file handle, it's always good to close our file handle. Okay? Now the last change we have to do, once we've opened our file for reading and opened our file for writing, we're going to go through each of the lines in our file, and instead of printing them to standard out, I'm going to put my new file handle here, file out. This should take all the lines of input from input.txt. It should uppercase them and print them to output.txt. So now let's run this program. Oh, looked like nothing happened. But that's to be expected. It's reading from a file and writing to a file. Nothing's happening through the terminal. So if I cat our input.txt, remember that this input comes from a file called input.txt is our input. And now if I look at our output.txt, we've got exactly the same text, except it's now all capitalized. Awesome. You can also create a file for appending. So if I want to append to the file output.txt, I'm going to run this program again, and what we should see, cat input.txt is exactly the same, but when I cat output.txt, you can see that extra input has been added to it. Now we've got the same thing twice. In fact, if I run it again, you can see it's there 3 times now. Whereas writing will actually overwrite whatever the file is. So now we've only got the input once. All right. So those are the main modes that you'll be using, reading, writing, and appending. But you can check out the Perl documentation to see what other kinds are out there. Cool, so now we're done. Now you know how to use input and output in Perl with both standard input, standard output, standard error, as well as opening and creating your own file handles to read and write to files.